thanks everyone for being here. As much as I think we could probably spend the next hour talking about jingles for NGOs, we're going to get started here. And I want to thank everybody for joining. Thanks, Erinch, for being here. We're really excited to hear more about the Doughnut Economics Action Lab and some of the tools that you all have built specifically for the business community. Before we dig in, I want to just acknowledge that we are recording this event, but we will not be recording the Q&A session. So if folks want to ask questions, they can, and know that that won't be posted publicly anywhere. But just to kind of tee up the conversation today and the content that we're going to hear from Erinch, I wanted to just say we at Drawdown Labs spend a lot of time sort of thinking about the role of business and the role of the business community in addressing the climate crisis. And you all sort of know this, but in many cases, businesses are the ones that are largely responsible for the emissions that cause climate change. And our perspective at Drawdown Labs is they also, are a very important actor in society in that they have the scale, resources, and obligation to help turn the tide towards reaching a point of drawdown and sort of pulling the world back from overshooting, this crucial planetary boundary of climate change. And as you've seen by now, this is the Drawdown-Aligned Business Framework and sort of our attempt at, getting all the leverage points that businesses have in addressing, the sort of planetary boundary of climate change out on the table so that we can start to action on them. And the model of labs is to support our members in sort of identifying and benchmarking and sort of taking action against these leverage points. And part of how we do that is to connect our members with the sort of select group of implementation partners to support the sort of action and execution side of the sort of priority leverage points that your particular business might have. And so that's kind of why we're here today. We had our workshop last week, and increasingly we're going to be focusing on specific leverage points as we sort of move forward, and specific implementation partners that are kind of where the rubber hits the road when it comes to executing against these different leverage points and helping our member companies kind of go further, faster. And so that's kind of where the Doughnut Economics Action Lab comes in. As an implementation partner of Drawdown Labs, they sit kind of most directly in this business model transformation leverage point. I think you could also make a case that they kind of fit into the long-term thinking leverage point as well. And I want to just kind of acknowledge, and you'll hear more about this from Erinch here shortly, but they kind of use Doughnut Economics uses a bit of a different sort of vocabulary. We talk about business model transformation. I think they think of it more through the lens of enterprise design. And so Erinch will talk a little bit more about kind of what this means to them. And then I also just want to acknowledge that, kind of by definition, Drawdown as an organization is, incredibly focused on sort of bending the curve of emissions, and emissions and climate change more broadly is really what our organization is focused on. But one of the things that we love about the Doughnut Economics Action Lab is that, climate change represents only one of the sort of 9 planetary boundaries that the Doughnut Economics model considers. And so it is kind of more of a full spectrum way of looking at sort of the poly crisis that we're in and how we can kind of pull the planet back from, this overshoot that we're in and get to sort of a safe and just space for humanity. So Erinch will go into more detail on all of this, but I did just kind of want to frame that up, given that we spend a lot of time talking with you all, our members and our implementation partners, about emissions and about climate change. And what you're going to hear today takes a bit of a broader lens. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Erinch to get started with his content.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks, Lana, and really wonderful to join this sort of passionate group of corporate thinkers, doers, change makers that are beginning to really change, I think, the direction of travel. So I'm going to present for about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll have a bit of a discussion, but we're such a smaller group today. So do feel free to interject, or if there's a point at which something needs to be clarified, or you've got an example or an insight to share on top. I'm very sort of open to being interrupted during the presentation in any way. So yeah, don't hold back if you've got things to add. but I'll begin sharing my screen now and sort of go through some of the concepts underpinning what we are doing with business and how we're taking Doughnut Economics into the world of business. And would love to sort of get reactions and reflections from all of you as well over time. So I'm going to switch over the presentation mode, and hopefully this is now showing the right screen. So Doughnut Design for Business, that's the name of the presentation, because that's the focus of Doughnut Economics. A little bit about me, so you know the perspective that this comes from. I began life in the corporate world. I was at Procter & Gamble for a number of years, working mostly on marketing and market strategy. Then moved over and worked in global supply chains based out of Indonesia and a few other places to see how we can get smallholder farmers to embrace sustainability, as well as achieve better incomes for their communities, before moving to Oxfam, where I was there for 7 years, leading various campaign initiatives and collaboration and partnerships with corporates as well to improve particularly social and ecological conditions in their supply chain. And most recently, I was the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization, which is the global body of businesses that have been set up with fair trade principles at their very heart. So that sort of has informed a lot of what you're going to hear and see today from the examples. And I joined Doughnut Economics Action Lab 18 months ago to lead our work bringing the donut to the world of business. The donut really has taken off as a conceptual framework. It's been something that has been embraced by various economic thinkers, political leaders, key individuals and thought leaders around the world. There's been a little bit of a take up that I think has taken all of us by surprise to an extent, because I think conceptually it's something that is bringing together two perspectives and isn't necessarily a hugely controversial observation. That we've got, on the one hand, 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientists have told us we must not transgress or overshoot, and we've got a social foundation, which is a whole bunch of things that we need to ensure everybody has the essentials of life. It's a fairly uncontroversial observation that both those goals should be at the heart of our economic thinking, but bringing that into a single framework has been a compelling one for, I think, a lot of people. So a community emerged around this idea. There was energy when Kate Raworth wrote the book and it became a bestseller. She quickly realized that there's a community of practice that's emerging here, and people started taking action. They started taking action at a neighborhood level, at a city level, at a regional level, at a country level. And from that, a bit of a community emerged that is much broader and much more global. So now our platform, the Doughnut Economics Action Lab platform, has got over 6,000 members from around the world, individual change makers, consultants, leaders of organizations, activists, teachers, political sort of operatives, people of all persuasions who think that the donut actually is a really useful tool to start to transform our economy. There's a lot of cities now, over 70 cities, some not shown on this map yet, that are taking action based on donut economics and have put that together as a framework to help push their economic thinking forward. And in reaction to all of this interest, what the Doughnut Economics Action Lab tries to do is convene and curate and create tools and stories and ways and methodologies that different change makers can use. So what you're going to hear today is those tools and concepts that are specifically designed for the world of business. That specific business tool is essentially encapsulated in this diagram that you might have seen in last week's very brief webinar that I had the chance to present at. And essentially, it's looking at the old economy, the economy of the 20th century that we've inherited, which has a donut in overshoot and shortfall that I'll represent in a bit more detail in a second, which is based around the question of how does the design of business block transformative action? How does the design of business stop us from taking the actions in the business world we need to reverse all of that overshoot and to start to turn around all the shortfall on life's essentials? And on the right, how do we move the design of business to a point where it can unlock transformative action? And the way we look at it is through the framework of purpose of a business, the networks the business is in, the governance of the business, the ownership model that underpins it, and the financial model that underpins it. And that's what we call enterprise design. We borrowed this concept from the theorist and author and great thought leader Marjorie Kelly, who's worked for decades on the concept of enterprise design, and we've applied it into this context. Everything you're going to hear today in this particular framework that I'll be going deeper into, it comes from work we've done the last 18 months. We did 22 different pilot workshop series, some 6, 7 workshops, some, you know, 1 or single or 2 or 3 workshops in a single series with over 300 businesses. It was a real big mix of corporates, such as those that are part of the British Retail Consortium, for instance, some corporates that we did work individually with, others are startups, others were private companies, others were existing social enterprises or cooperatives or other sort of purpose-led models. There was a real mix of businesses that helped us create these concepts that we've then created a tool around. So that's sort of a bit of a brief intro to the content of what I'm going to present. But to take a step back, I mean, why did the donut come to being, and why does the donut apply to the world of business? Well, essentially what we observe is that the 21st century has begun with a series of crises. There was the financial meltdown from 2008 that many of us are still remembering, the climate breakdowns that are becoming more prevalent, more stark, and the protest crackdowns that are stopping people from defending the rights of nature and trying to prevent action that would protect nature and our ecology, and the COVID lockdowns, which also demonstrated the fact that, you know, we're transgressing into ecological territory that also has impacts on our health, has impacts on virus creation and other forms. So from meltdowns to breakdowns to crackdowns to lockdowns, it's been a century of crisis. And the response to this that we're proposing is a donut, which we say is a compass for human prosperity. As you know, the outside boundary is the planetary boundaries, those 9 planetary boundaries that Earth system scientist Professor Rockstrom and his team have pulled together and researched and said these are ones we must not transgress. As Ted mentioned, it goes beyond climate change, but so many of these are interlinked. I mean, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions has so much of a link with ocean acidification, for instance. Biodiversity loss is driven through land conversions, including deforestation, which has huge impacts on climate change. You know, nitrogen phosphorus loading has itself greenhouse gas related impacts and climate impacts as well. So while they're presented as 9 different planetary boundaries, they're intrinsically interlinked with each other. So we present it in this way. It also has at the center the social foundations, the goals that come from the Sustainable Development Goals, the social goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. What I think is interesting about this perspective is to also recognize that, look, we need to make sure that the economy is creating enough of those social outcomes that it is working and allowing a thriving society to also come about. And that means that we have to design for both. We have to design our economies, our businesses, our financial structures, our policy ecosystems in order to not transgress either of those boundaries, the social foundation nor the ecological ceiling. Another perspective that sort of ties together the social and the ecological is that if our economic activities has got an ecological footprint, then the way that we are prioritizing and optimizing that economic activity in order to create the maximum social benefit is also critical. So we need to make sure that the two come together. If we're missing the social and we're just focusing on the ecological, people aren't necessarily going to go into a corner and just starve. They will have other economic activity that will pop up that will have an ecological footprint. So the solutions we generate have to consider both. They have to create the essentials of life as well as respecting the boundaries of our planet. Unfortunately, the picture that comes out is a negative one. It's one where humanity is living dangerously out of balance. We are both in overshoot of our planet's boundaries and in shortfall of hundreds of millions of people on life's essentials. In fact, the picture looks even worse in reality than is shown here. If we look at chemical pollution and air pollution, it's shown in gray there because at the time it wasn't quantified. Scientists were still working on how to quantify those planetary boundaries. Well, actually, chemical pollution has since been quantified and is also in the red. So the reds are now, even worse than it looks there. And we have a significant problem on our hands. We're also falling short for hundreds of millions of people on things like food, water, healthcare, education, income, all the things our economy needs to create in order for people to have thriving and meaningful lives. At a national level, so we can drill down at a national level as well. The picture also tells us a really interesting story, one where we have the world's richer countries, higher income countries, global north countries, whichever terminology we'd like to use, have met most of their people's needs while massively overshooting their fair share of the planet's resources. In the global south, in lower income countries like Malawi, for instance, the reverse is true, where there's a huge shortfall on life's essentials, but the country itself is not actually using its own fair share of the planet's boundaries. So the picture essentially tells us that every country is a developing country now. None of us are developed economies. The picture on the right of the US, UK, or even China now as a growing middle income country is not one that should be replicated as a trajectory of development. This is based on an economic model, an industrial model that cannot be replicated and needs to be reversed and transformed. Now, the picture is true no matter who you switch into this. Australia, where I grew up, I'm originally from Turkey, but grew up in Australia, is even worse than most European or northern countries. But also, if you look at Sweden, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, whichever country we look at, they are all in overshoot. And even other global south countries like Laos is beginning to be in overshoot while still falling short on life's essentials. So something is incredibly broken, and some of the tweaks and the nudges that we've started to create in the last couple of decades is not enough. A more fundamental transformation needs to happen of our models of economic development and trajectory. So how have we come to this level? Well, one of the perspectives is that we've created a degenerative model of take, make, use, lose, where we take from Earth resources, we make things, we use things, and we lose things, and repeat this over and over again. And in fact, if we slow down this process, then we call it an economic recession. So we've tied ourselves economically to a model of consumption and growth of consumption that is addicted to a take, make, use, lose culture. It underpins the reality of so many of our industries, particularly consumer goods industries, of course, that needs to transform. Now, we're beginning to see some really interesting innovations among the business world, among the pioneers in business, that are moving away from that degenerative model towards a regenerative model, where we are working with and within the cycles of the living world. And this is just a very simplified version of the circular economy diagram, where we're creating loops for both biological materials that can be regenerated, as well as for technical materials which can be restored. So if you think of, clothing and garments, synthetic fibers, while they should be maybe reduced or even eliminated at a very bare minimum, can be restored and recycled to go into those technical material loops on the right-hand side. And the natural fibers, which can be broken down, can actually go back into regenerative loops. And these sorts of processes of bringing regenerative industrial design into the world of business is beginning to take root. Now, what we're beginning to see as well in that journey from degenerative to regenerative is actually there is a little bit of a stepping stone in between for many businesses and many industries, that is sustainability. So the reason we put sustainability potentially provocatively as a part of that journey, as a stepping stone, but not an end goal, is that sustainability has been defined by many as essentially reducing and eventually eliminating harm, eliminating damage. So for instance, going from landscape degradation and deforestation on the left, which is unarguably degenerative, to at least getting to zero deforestation. That's fine, that's good, but we've done some damage to the land, and we've got to go beyond doing no harm. We've got to go all the way to restoring the landscapes and restoring and regenerating those natural ecosystems. And there are now approaches that can actually help do that, whether it's rewilding or whether it's forms of organic agriculture that can bring nutrients and soil back into health, into a healthy form, for instance. Those regenerative ideas are beginning to take root. The same analogy can be brought to product design, where we've had decades now of built-in obsolescence. Whether it's deliberate or implied or it's incidental, we're seeing so many consumer goods that end up in landfill way too quickly. And a lot of the goal has been, well, how do we get to 100% recyclable? Recycling is fine. It's a helpful stepping stone to reduce waste and to create some cycles, but it's also very energy intensive. It's got other shortcomings. And a more regenerative approach would be, well, how do we design products that can be repaired, that are maybe modular in their design so they can be upgraded? Ideas that allow us to have much more longevity of life, so that the end of product life cycle doesn't necessarily lead to a very energy intensive recycling process, but actually has a different relationship between the consumer and the producer of that product. So these regenerative ideas are beginning to take root. Yes. Hi.
So I really like this slide because it helps show like the different paradigms that we can travel through, basically, with us being in degenerative on the left. My question is, how much do you think that this is linear, where we have to become sustainable before we become regenerative? And how much do you think is like, we need to skip the sustainable paradigm and go right to regenerative?
It's a great question, Breen. And in fact, I was speaking to a few business leaders earlier today about this and looking at, well, are there industries where we can leapfrog, where we need to go straight to regenerate, and other industries where actually it's useful to go through sustainable, it's useful to reduce waste, it's useful to reduce harm. And I think it really depends on the kind of sector and industry. I think in product
Could you give some examples? I'm just super interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. For instance, in product design, getting to a recyclable product isn't necessarily a stepping stone to a modular product. So designing a phone in a way where a lot of the components can be recycled is a different industrial transition process than getting to a product that is designed deliberately to be repairable by the consumer, upgradable by the consumer, etc. Whereas, say in agriculture, first step might be to stop deforestation before you can restore the landscape. Before you start to have models that are going to be agroecology focused or organic focused, that are going to replenish nutrients in the soil. So I mean, I think in product design, focusing a lot of effort on recyclability might just delay the difficult transition to modular product design that has to happen later without helping that.
Okay, that makes sense. Like from our perspective, we focus, so we're on the sustainable investing side. So we've just thought of or at least one of the things I've been thinking about is we're looking at investing in the public markets and companies that are sustainable, but I'd love to see there be some evolution to like regenerative investing, but it doesn't really exist in the public markets yet, and so it's like, that's aspirational, but it would be bullshit if we said we were doing it right now, so it's like, it's helpful to understand where you're at on this.
Yeah, and we're not that propositional yet about having a framework for determining exactly what makes a cut for a regenerative or doesn't, and we're sort of trying to catalyze others to kind of, all right, is something
you haven't become the Project Drawdown or Regenerative.
And I think, I mean, and the other thing to add to this slide for anyone interested is the inspiration for regenerative. A lot of those ideas come from the work of people like Janine Benyus on biomimicry. The B3.8, which has been a real inspiration for us, and particularly Kate. I mean, she spent quite a bit of the year with us last year. With her team, we were looking at ideas of how do we take inspiration from the design of nature, where nature doesn't do zero damage, nature doesn't do zero waste, nature creates benefits. If the buildings we're in today didn't exist, there'll be a wildland that would be sequestering carbon. It wouldn't be getting to zero carbon. It would be, cleaning the groundwater, it would be cleaning the air, it would be putting nutrients in the soil, it would be creating benefits, a cycle of benefits. And how do we bring that into industrial design? So I'm going to give an example later of Interface Carpets, which is a very large US company that has started to use biomimicry to bring a more regenerative practice into its like product design and its manufacturing design, for instance. So that's the ecological side. I'll move over to, and do keep jumping in, guys. I can't see the screen, so feel free to speak over me to get the attention as needed. There's also, of course, the I'll go deeper actually on those ideas. On the regenerative practices, there are quite a few companies now beginning to do the kind of things I'm talking about. There's Fairphone, which is based out of the Netherlands. It's been there for about 10 years now. That has created modular phones. So it's repairable, it's deliberately designed in a way where you can upgrade components and parts, and it brings that sort of design aspect to its core. Interface Carpets, which has asked itself, how can a factory behave like a forest? Like, can we design this so that it's not just circular, so they have a circular logic because they sell carpets to an industrial consumer face and a commercial consumer, but that is sort of in squares and it's repairable and recyclable. So you're minimizing the amount of sort of ecological or material footprint, but also the manufacturing process is now looking at how do you sequester carbon, how do you make sure that the groundwater is cleaner when it leaves a factory than when it came into the factory. So replicating some of the inspiration from biomimicry. Examples like Sanergy in Kenya, which is taking waste from very affordable toilets that they run across the slums of Nairobi, and actually taking the human waste, treating it, turning it into organic fertilizer to be used for food production. You know, it's a very vivid example of a biological loop that involves human waste. But of course, others from fashion like Houdini, which is in Sweden, a company that is designing circular fabrics and circular garments. And what's interesting is that not only are the natural fibers and synthetic fibers separatable, but they've made all of their designs open source. So they've said, look, to their industry, we want to collaborate. We want you to learn from us. Our business model isn't to reach maximum market share on our own. We've got to build on each other's innovations, and the open source aspect of regenerative product design, I think, has been quite inspiring for many. So of course, yeah, these are some of the ecological sides. There's a social side as well, which is critically important here, because we do need to get to a point where growth of economic inequality has to be reversed in some way if we're going to live within the donut, if we're going to meet both planetary and ecological and social goals. And here it's about how do we share opportunity and value with all who co-create it far more equitably. And there's a similar journey here in terms of how do we go from what's clearly seen as being, you know, like things like poverty wages, clearly a divisive model of economic activity, to the inclusive model, which is a living wage, people earning enough to meet their basic needs, but just enough to meet their basic needs, all the way through to a more distributive model. Can some of the upside be shared more broadly? Is there a way that, you know, a part of the profits can also be shared with a broader employee base, or a broader base of individuals who have helped co-created in their supply chain, for instance? I mean, a similar analogy can be extended to the way businesses interact and engage with each other within industries. So all the way from aggressively enforcing patents on the left and having this sort of hyper-competitive approach to, you know, technology partnerships, which we're beginning to see. But can we go all the way to open source design ideas? Like, that's Drupal there, the technology company, but I mentioned Houdini earlier. You can do it with product design as well. So these are some of the emerging ideas. It doesn't mean that it's applicable in every industry, in every instance, and it may or may not fit in every circumstance in the current market conditions. But things that are distributive, like open source, like, you know, having a profit share model, can be a way of helping business into the donut. So those are some of the ideas on distributive side. What do we mean by this in practice? So examples can be worker ownership models or worker voice models, like Creative Handicrafts, a business I know quite well, based out of Mumbai, that's owned by several hundred factory workers collectively, to, you know, Richer Sounds in the UK, a major retail outlet that converted to employee ownership. Like in the US, actually, in the UK, there is a tax advantage if you sell your business to your employees in some form. So that they don't pay capital gains tax if they are able to have that sort of a employee ownership conversion, all the way to fair B&B, which has popped up as a way of promoting slow tourism, as well as much more community focused benefits, using 50% of their revenue to share with local community groups who decide on how to take the best out of tourism and compensate for some of the negative impacts, as well as being more distributive in terms of who can list, so that only landlords that can list can only have 2 properties on there, for instance, to have a more distributive approach to fair tax, which is of course another issue of paying a fair share of tax rather than the minimum tax to enable all those essential public services to be financed and funded. And there's a fair tax mark, and companies around the world are beginning to say, look, this is an important part of our obligation to help meet the basic needs of society. Does someone want to come in there? I heard a noise for a second. If not,
I was curious how you've talked about the benefits from a tax perspective, but I'm curious about the process, because I mean, there's companies on this call that are either nonprofits, which don't have like a traditional ownership structure, or they're publicly traded companies, which have like, would need to be taken private maybe in a unique way, or are VC backed, or are owned by a few people. Like, it's just like I'm just curious how you've seen these transitions actually happen. Like, the incentive makes sense to me, but like the transition seems like where it gets like where like a lot of learning would be beneficial.
Yeah, really good question, Bree. I mean, I'm going to go into quite a few examples in the second half of my presentation on enterprise design, and looking at how the governance model can emerge and evolve from one, for any of those. And you're right, for startups, it depends as well how capital intensive they are, how strong their commercial proposition is when they engage with venture capital and open up a term sheet and be able to structure themselves in a different way for governance purposes, for business model purposes, for ownership model purposes, for instance. So a lot of it will depend even within those categories: a private company, publicly listed, a family business, foundation owned, or charity owned, or whatever it might be. There's lots of models. Even within them, there's a whole layer of complexity around their where they are in their maturity cycle, if they're early stage or late stage, and then another one on what their capital needs are, and their relationship with investors, and whether they have a proposition where actually their risk profile is so low that they can negotiate a more interesting and innovative design of organizational ownership and governance to enable them to do some of these things. But yeah, absolutely great point. I see some points in the chat. I'm not necessarily seeing all of those, but do jump in.
That was just me. I was just saying Vanguard is really interesting because they started this structurally, but they didn't make the transition. So like Vanguard Investing, they have an ownership structure where their customers actually are the owners of the company.
That's right.
Just by investing in their mutual funds. It's like a super interesting thing that I don't see very often. Like I don't like that they invest a lot in fossil fuels, but like their ownership structure has been fascinating for me.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. So then what we normally do, and here's this next slide is a bit of an insight into what it looks like to run this workshop then with companies, with colleagues, with networks of businesses, entrepreneurs. What we ask is, after presenting some of this content, is say, look, let's see if we can generate the biggest, boldest ideas for you from a strategy point of view, from a practice point of view, from a business model point of view, that will allow you to help humanity into the donut. And start to identify things that are regenerative and distributive by design, and start to ask yourself, what will your business need to start doing and what will need to stop doing to belong to that future economy, and to consider all sorts of perspectives in doing that. And they come up with some things, based on that, and they fill out this canvas we have where they start to think, okay, what will be regenerative? What will be distributive? So for instance, they say, we're only going to use life-friendly chemistry in our packaging. We're going to have factories that sequester carbon. We're going to, make sure that the prices we pay our suppliers are going to make it possible to at least pay double of a living wage, not just the bare essential to meet the basics of life. Or, they come up with these ideas. And then we challenge them again, because I think what we find with business leaders at this point is when we throw these ideas out, there's a lot of pragmatic reasons why they can't pursue these bold ideas. And we need to put them on the table, even if they're not possible or viable yet. So then we jump to the next level and say, okay, well, let's have a bit of a stakeholder board here. Why don't you pick the stakeholders that are most impacted? It could be your local community, it could be nearby forests and rivers, it could be air, soil, your employees, your supply chain workers, future generations, investors, and just let's form groups. Everyone's representing the perspective of a different stakeholder that's impacted. It doesn't have to pick 3 or 4 of these that are really critical. And they get really often very heated at this point, because they start to really embody that stakeholder's perspective. And they start to say, look, I'm the soil and you are degrading me. You're taking nutrients out, and actually in 20 years time, this is not going to be good soil for growing anything in anymore. So you know, why aren't you transitioning? Or they think from future generations perspective, you know, that this product doesn't belong in the future economy. It's got health impacts, it's got ecological impacts that just can be minimized, the negative impacts, but they'll never be a positive impact. And they start to sort of come up with a bigger and bolder ideas. And that becomes a really pivotal point, because once we identify really bold ideas that test the limits of what's possible today, we then move on to, well, how then might we need to redesign this business to unlock ideas such as those, unlock that sort of ambition. And what we noticed is that there's a whole bunch of things that block those sorts of ideas. And we found that, you know, outdated processes, rigid financial targets, short-term thinking, a culture of hierarchy, all these things that are prevalent among companies that are stuck in more degenerative, divisive models of doing business and trade. And the ones that are able to pursue more ambitious ideas tend to suspend practicality. They tend to have broader perspectives, longer term thinking, and a culture that enables courageous views to emerge from across the business. And then we sort of started looking deeper about what is it that then allows the right-hand side to happen. Why does a company think long-term? Why does it have broader perspectives? Why is it able to suspend practicality in order to at least unpack some big ideas? And we found that so many businesses are limited by their design. So, you know, in our work, we met a tea industry executive that really was concerned about the wages of the tea pickers. But what he said was, look, paying tea pickers a living wage cannot mean paying our suppliers more for their tea. The market just won't reward this. They need to fund it by raising productivity. We met a major beauty brand senior executive, actually ran this workshop with them in the pilot stage, publicly listed, you know, huge global beauty brand. I signed the NDA, so I can't reveal their name, who told us that and this is a company that made huge you know, carbon reduction commitments, science-based target commitments that, you know, are very well regarded in their industry. And they said, look, in order to meet those commitments on climate, we should introduce refillable perfume bottles, because most of their carbon was essentially in the production of the glass bottles and the pumps that are part of their production process. But bringing consumers on board needs investment, and the payback period on that internal capital expenditure is just too long. We can't do this. We met another sort of head of innovation at a major clothing brand who told us that, in fact, it was Kate that met this person. I've been asked to create a range of regenerative clothing while being expected to deliver the usual 15% profit margins from the outset. This is impossible. So we started to see there's something in the design of these companies that's blocking these big ideas that are going to have a huge impact on climate, on wages and income, on agriculture, you know, regenerative agriculture. All these things are being blocked somehow, and these are all possible. These are all commercially viable, but not profit maximizing. You know, and there was that distinction that started to emerge, and we realized that there's something in the design of companies. There's something in the way we design other organizations and institutions that aren't necessarily held back in the same way, but many businesses are. And it limits what's possible to this small overlap where business as usual, which is designed to maximize margins and dividends, can do some of these things if it meets its strict parameters. But what if we were to redesign business to unlock some of these regenerative and distributive possibilities? I'm going to race through the last few slides to make sure there's at least sort of 10 minutes or so for us to have a bit of a discussion. Sort of race through these, I just want to also recognize that redesigning business is one of many levers of change. There are so many other ways of transforming business that are also really important, like exerting public pressure, bringing in regulations, bringing in sort of collective organizing, creating enlightened leadership that can drive from the C-suite some big change, having better targets, having better metrics, impact measurements, goal setting for companies on social ecological grounds, making the business case more effectively, business case based on maybe the resilience or the future social license to operate of a business longer term. But essentially, to reinforce all of these and to drive further ambition, Doughnut Economics focuses on transforming the deep design of business. So what we mean by that is essentially, how do we move from that old model of designing companies, which is around how much value can we extract through this enterprise, and how would we design a business that is based around how many benefits can we generate through this enterprise? And we use this purpose networks, governance, ownership, and finance model that was taken from the work of author and theorist Marjorie Kelly. And essentially here, I'm going to go through these quickly one by one and answers, your last point a little bit here, Breen, as well, around how does this transition happen? I mean, the first one is just a quick one looking at purpose. And, purpose, I think here is important to acknowledge that it is not just about what's written, it's about how is that purpose manifested in the operations of the business and the products it creates and services and supply chains, etc. And the example of a more degenerative and divisive purpose often comes from, for instance, fast fashion, where the business model itself is locked into a model that has to produce as fast as possible, as much as possible for as cheap as possible. And within those parameters, purpose is limited. What that company can be is absolutely limited. But if the business model can shift and the broader enterprise design can shift, you can have very different models like Manaus del Uruguay, which is co-owned by 12 different women producer organizations spread across Uruguay and set up in 1968, multi-million-dollar company now. It's co-owned, co-governed by those women artisan groups who are able to embed this into a much broader mission that is about slow fashion, using natural fibers, creating very high-end products that are going to last much longer. And that sort of purpose, I think, starts to shift the bounds of possibilities. Next is networks, and these are all about the relationships between the business and all the different stakeholders, whether it's customers and staff and governments, etc. And here we talk not just about, on the left-hand side, the commodified relationships that underpin a lot of its networks, but the example of, for instance, El Puente, a business I got to know well during the pandemic when I was leading the World Fair Trade Organization and COVID hit, and we started seeing global suppliers around the world of food, agriculture, garments, homewares. They're seeing their orders cut, canceled, prices renegotiated, payment terms changed over time, and risk essentially passed on to parts of the global supply chain that are least able to bear that risk. El Puente did the opposite. It provided greater financial flexibility. It had these long-term, multi-decade partnerships with suppliers around the world. The reason it was able to do that as well is it had a representative of those suppliers on its board. So it had a governance model that actually said, look, there's a supply chain representative here where the suppliers come together every 2 years and they elect a representative to sit on the board to bring these issues from the supply chain into the boardroom of El Puente. It goes beyond supply chains, of course, it's for services companies as well, whether it's their relation with government or what kind of alliances and networks they join, like Project Drawdown, which is a progressive alliance of solution-oriented companies that are helping bring action into the corporate world. So that's the network side. Governance, which is about decision-making, about power, about company rules and culture and metrics of success and transparency, all the things that dictate decision-making across the company. And essentially here, how do we move towards governance being in service of purpose? The example here comes from River Simple, which has got this custodianship, future guardian custodianship model based out of Wales. It creates hydrogen cars, whatever you might think of the product itself. The governance model actually is interesting because it's got different stakeholders, again, represented on its board, including its staff, as well as the environments represented on the board. A company that transitioned recently into a model that has got an interesting governance structure is, for instance, Faith in Nature, which is in the beauty sector more broadly in the UK and Europe, but they've put Earth on their board. So they've said, look, we need to make sure that one of our board is completely responsible representing the interests of our planet. They've put the organization Lawyers for Nature as a permanent voting board member, for instance. It starts to change the dynamics of decision-making in a company when at the highest level of governance, the planet is represented. If we move to ownership, of course, ownership is central to all of this. Patagonia recently, I think, as everyone knows, Earth became its only shareholder. What's interesting about Patagonia is it drew heavily from the steward ownership model, which is really prevalent in Northern Europe. In fact, in Germany, they're going to create a legal form around how to become a steward-owned company. Companies like Bosch, Ecosia, Einhorn, ShareTribe are all steward-owned companies, for instance. What Patagonia did that drew inspiration from that model is it said, we're going to have two separate share classes. We're going to have a share class that has all the dividend rights and a share class that has all of the voting rights. We're going to separate money and power in our ownership model. So those that receive the dividends don't have an ability to pressure us to increase profits constantly. And those that control the voting rights actually are the custodians of the purpose of the business more broadly. So those sorts of innovative models of ownership are beginning to happen. Employee ownership conversions are happening often in companies where there's a generational shift, and workers and employees are coming together to create a trust, which has then able to borrow money to buy out the company, and over time pays the loan off and ends up with an employee-owned company. I'll power through the last couple of things just to sort of finish off, but finance is the last thing. And here, of course, it's about those financial parameters, margins, dividends, etc. All these things that are so central that are often missing from sustainability discussions. These, it's kind of the realm of the big boys that talks about capital expenditure and dividends and margins and investment. But this is absolutely critical to what's possible often in companies, and putting that on the table and saying, how would we design the finance of a company to enable the biggest ideas? Loads of benefits to redesigning companies, including making sure there's alignment across the business, enabling deep partnerships, ensuring there's investment into innovations, ensuring that the mission of the company is protected against hostile takeovers, for instance, and making sure that the company is regenerative and distributive by design. The way we look through all this in the tool is essentially we go through and take the biggest ideas, put them on the top and ask the question, which aspects of the design block transformative ideas, which aspects of the design can unlock transformative ideas. Companies end up coming up with ways that their design holds them back and ways that they can evolve by, for instance, changing who's represented on the board, including maybe through an observer seat to begin with, or creating a fund, for instance, that allows for certain ecological or social ideas that don't meet margin requirements to attract internal investment, or to create sort of long-term commitments to a handful of suppliers where there's going to be greater social ecological impact. All these things can fundamentally reshape design. We've got a bunch of questions we also ask companies on how they might do this, how they might evolve their design. And all this is available on our website, by the way, and I'll share the link on the back of this. And the tool's available for anyone to use. We've got some rules over consultancies and others that use it with clients that need to be values aligned, but there's a bit of a process on doughnut-economics.org. And yeah, it's all through the link provided here. And there are two versions of the tool. There's a 5-hour version and a 2-hour version. All the materials, all the concepts I just presented, the case studies and the activities in PDF form and Miro form are all there. The guidance for facilitators is all there. And our model is essentially to empower change makers to run through this journey within their own companies, with their startups, with big companies, with networks, whichever organization that engages with business, they're able to hopefully use this in a way to drive a new conversation about how do we redesign business to unlock transformative action. I'll pause there.